So today I'm going to be taking a look at my first ever kind of extended hands-on with a Moser. It's a brand that I've really been interested in for a long time, and thankfully a friend of mine let me borrow it, so let's get into the review. So we have a diameter of about 41.5, lug to lug of 46.1, height of 11.2, and a lug width of 22 millimeters. Some of the general specifications for this watch, we're going to have the H Moser HMC 200 caliber beating away in here. It is finished with Moser's proprietary striping type technique. It is also a completely in-house movement right down to the hairspring itself. It has a 72-hour power reserve bidirectional winding system as well. The case, as you can probably guess, is bronze. It is, I believe, the first time Moser has ever used bronze in a watch. It is apparently a copper aluminum blend, so I don't really know how this will oxidize. It hasn't oxidized yet, just from me touching it and wearing it a little bit, so it seems to hold up pretty decently. It doesn't degrade too fast. All the numerals are done in what Moser calls a globalite numeral, and it is basically a 3D ceramic structure which has superluminova infilled to make it glow. So this is a limited edition of 50 pieces that came out around the tail end of last year. It was basically to commemorate the fact that Russia in the very beginning history of H. Moser was a very large market, and they were just paying kind of homage to that. That's why we have the Cyrillic script for H. Moser and C at the 12 o'clock. We do have a domed sapphire crystal on the front and sapphire crystal on the back as well. And lastly, the watch retailed for around $19,600. So moving on to the dial of this watch, it has what Moser calls its black ore dial, or black ore fume dial. It is this very interesting grayish anthracite color that fades to near black at the edges, as a classic fume dial does. It is this very gentle and subtly brown color that I think works perfectly with the bronze case and the more golden styled hands. Looking a little bit more generally, as I mentioned earlier, we have these globalite Arabic numerals on the dial, 1 through 12 here. We also have the railroad's outer track, and each 5-minute mark is just kind of delineated on the dial there. Of course, we have the H. Moser & Co. done in the Cyrillic script at 12, and what I would consider a kind of sword-style handset here. The entire watch is done very cleanly, and I think almost most importantly, very legibly. It is undoubtedly easy to read because you have all the numerals loomed and the hands loomed. You can read it easily in the dark as well. I like that Moser kept the text very, very minimal here. I mean, it generally just says the name of the brand on the dial. I think at the end of the day, if you're spending this much on a watch, you probably already know that it either has, a 3-day power reserve or that it's automatic or whatnot. And if you don't, I'm sure the salesperson could explain that to you. And at the end of the day, I think the simplicity of the dial lets the finer details shine a little bit more. The fume dial is really on center stage here. It takes up the most attention. It pops the most out of everything. And I think that's cool. It's kind of what Moser is known for, and they execute it very well here. Here it is more natural lighting. As you can see, the fume does really pop nicely. Going to direct sunlight, it does become a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more browner, but gives you general overall idea. Pretty cool fume pattern, and I think it's done pretty well. As you can see, it goes almost black at certain angles. It's pretty fun. So looking at the Moser up close, and you can really see that gentle gradient to the dial from gray to black to, I guess, blacker. I think one of the things you might notice the most are these tiny little, like, larger black dots within the texture. At first it may seem almost like a misprint or an imperfection, but I just think that's part of Moser's design process. As you can see at the edge, it kind of combines into a more textural, almost asphalt-like pattern. So I think it's just a design process, and at the end of the day, I don't think it looks bad. It's not something I notice from wrist view. I don't think like, oh, that dot looks very, very big on wrist. So just keep that in mind. Looking at the numerals, they are pretty awesome. They have a good shape to them. They have a good geometry. They rise off the dial quite a bit, and they are very, very pure white, which is nice to see. They match fairly closely with the white of the railroad's track there, even though it's not a perfect color match, but you don't really notice that. And even then, looking at the railroad track, you do see how kind of three-dimensional the printing is. So attention to detail was definitely paid here. At first impression, the handset doesn't look too bad, but if you zoom in a little closer and just kind of take a look, there are pretty rough patches along it. There's like little fibers, maybe even little micro scratches in the surface of this hour hand here. Thankfully, the rest of the hand looks better, and the lumen fill is actually pretty flat and nicely uniform. Moving on to the hour hand, you have some similar kind of QC issues. The base of the hour hand there, a little bit of scratching, that little dot on the right hand side of the hand there. And then similarly some scratching towards the end of the hand there, which is kind of unfortunate to see. I don't know if it's because of the coating or because of the brass or whatnot. At the end of the day, the rest of the dial is done very nicely, but I don't know. You do see the QC issues on the hands. Is that acceptable at this price point? I don't think so, but I'll leave that up to you. So moving on to the case of this watch, we have what I think is a very simple case, but a very well done one. It definitely reminisces like those old pocket watch conversions, which just had those welded on lugs, and gives that similar feel. The whole case itself is done in this somewhat blasted finish, and the case back itself is stainless steel just because you don't want brass really rubbing against the skin all the time. You do have a welded on lug style look, however, you can see the lug actually does sit into the case. So it's a little bit more intricate than just welding it on. Looking at the side profile, the watch itself is fairly thin. You have a little bit of like a cutout with coin edging here on both sides and the signed M for Moser in the crown there. The crown itself is basically a really flat onion style crown. It is really easy to grip, really easy to wind. There's a nice feel to it. And I think it's very proportional within the watch itself. It doesn't look too large. It's very close to the case body. And there's not really like a lot of sunlight shining through between the case itself and the crown. One thing I want to note is, of course, this is a 42mm watch, which seems large at first, and it has large numerals, it has a very expansive dial, and it really is almost all dial. But thankfully, because it is a very, very traditional circular mid case with this welded on lug style, it actually wears a lot smaller than you would expect it to. Flipping the case over, we do see we have a nice sapphire display case back with the HMC 200 movement on display. It has that beautiful striping on it. It gives you a very large kind of almost 3/4 bridge look, and a really nice beveling on almost every end of metal you could see kind of along the bridges here, inside the screw chatons, and the screws themselves are black polish, so you get a nice little effect there. Zooming on the movement, as you can see, it is pretty well finished. You see all the beveling along the edges of the brushed parts. And specifically here, you do see we have a full balanced bridge, which gives it a little bit more stability. And it's a little bit more complicated to do. We have the gold accents here with the classic H. Moser crest and some just numbering. And yes, even though we don't get those blue screws, we still do get the nice rubies that pop out with a little bit of color on the watch, and these little gold accents both in the kind of cogs and in the lettering. So although it maybe isn't as beautiful, quote unquote, as it could be, it is still a very, very nice movement to look at. One other thing to note is the movement is, although it's not rough to wind, it is just very loud and kind of screechy in a way, not necessarily a super refined sounding movement. The rotor as well is on the louder side, but I've never really noticed it while wearing it, but just something to keep in mind. If I bring in my Grand Seiko here by comparison, I'll wind these two watches kind of away from the mic and then towards the mic. And then the same thing for the Grand Seiko. So overall, the Moser is a little bit more higher pitched and a little bit more screechy in a way. So I don't know if all the HMC 200 calibers are like that, or if maybe that was just a design choice for this one because it feels more pocket watch-esque. But regardless of that, when setting the crown, it pulls out very easy, very reassuringly, and when you move the hands around, it feels very smooth doing that as well. And last but not least, talking about the strap, I think it pairs perfectly. This is I believe it's called kudu leather. It has this almost distressed kind of nubuck feel to it, and it is like different shades of gray. I think it just pairs pretty well with the grayish brown dial, and it makes it look a little bit, I guess, not as dressy. It gives it a sporty, distressed feel, and I just think it is a pretty good quality strap. Calf skin on the back. Nice bronze matching buckle with the H Moser and C logo on it. So definitely didn't skip out on the strap, and it feels good quality. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing the closest thing I have to a Moser, which is my fake little Moser Vanta black dial, which also is known as an Apple Watch. As you can see here, the 42 actually wears pretty well on my wrist. 42 is usually a little bit too big for me, out of my comfort zone most of the time, but it just obviously depends on case shape. Because this is so round and the lugs are fairly short and the lugs are fairly thin, it doesn't look too bad. And even if I move the watch up a little bit and I have closer to like a 6-inch wrist right there, you can still get away with it. It doesn't overhang, it doesn't look terribly proportioned, I don't think. And it is a nice wearing watch. It's fairly thin, it conforms pretty well. The overall circular case leads to there just being a very comfortable fit on wrist because there are no sharp edges. It is just a very comfortable watch. Looking at the watch from a side view, as you can see, it does conform pretty well on wrist. It doesn't really rise up the wrist too tall. The lugs do turn down a lot, so they really meet the wrist very nicely. They very much bend the strap to conform to your wrist. So overall, the wearing experience is pretty awesome with this watch. If I had just read the specs online, being a 42mm watch, I definitely would have discounted it, but in person it actually wears surprisingly well. So you can definitely wear this on a larger wrist because it is a large watch, and thankfully you can actually get away with it on a small wrist. So moving on to other straps, we're going to go to this black textile canvas type strap that Moser actually includes with this watch as well. They did skimp out a little bit because they didn't really include an extra buckle. You just have to transfer it over, and they also don't have holes in the buckle, so it makes it a little bit more tedious. I think with this watch being both a limited edition, coming with an extra strap, and also being like $3 or $4 grand more expensive than the base model three-hander, I think an extra buckle wouldn't have been out of the question. I think it probably should have been included. And there we have it, the black textile strap. And one thing I would like to note is that this strap and the kudu strap both have slightly curved spring bars. And I don't think it would have been out of the question just to use a completely straight spring bars, because it still looks like there's a decent amount of lug clearance there. So I don't really know why they really went with that. It does kind of follow along with the circular shape that is mirrored in most of the rest of the watch, but even then I think a straight spring bar might have been a little bit better because you have a little bit of less daylight shining through. And there we have the strap on my 6.5-inch wrist. I don't think it conforms as well as the kudu leather does. I also don't think the tones match as perfectly. It is fairly nice because at certain angles the dial can look pretty black, so it does blend in that sense, and it does give it a sportier feel, but I do think the kudu leather is a little better matched. Next up, we have this strap from Cheapest NATO Straps. I believe it is called like the Heritage Sand or something similar to that. At the end of the day, this is a $14 strap on basically a $20,000 watch, but I also don't have a lot of 22mm watch straps, so forgive me. Even with that being said, I don't think it matches too badly. The brownish tone of the leather matches well with the subtle brown tones to the gray dial, and the suede dresses it down nicely. I think it pairs pretty well. Maybe get a slightly better quality one, but definitely not a bad color combo. And lastly, we have my Archer silicone strap that you can buy on Amazon for like 14 bucks. I think it pairs pretty well. The white tones really bring out the white of the numerals. It is very fun, it is very summery, and I think it almost tones down the bronzeness of the case. It makes the white tones a lot more prevalent, and I think that's cool. There we have it on wrist, super comfortable, and with this strap especially, just because it plants the watch so well, you can just see how well it wears. The watch is completely within the bounds of my wrist, and again, I only have a 6.5-inch wrist, which isn't very big. So this 42mm watch wears amazingly well, it wears amazingly comfortable, and again, it isn't even that thick, so it is a very nicely wearing watch, and I think it looks pretty good too. Taking a look at the lume here, as you can see, the markers pretty much just glow beautifully. They are very legible, they shine fairly brightly. What's really nice is the hands and the markers have a very, very similar color temperature. One's not really brighter than each other, so it is a very, I guess, harmonious lume signature. It is not the brightest, to be quite honest, and it doesn't last incredibly long, but while it does last, it is very legible, and I think it looks pretty good. So reluming it up and comparing it to my Timex really quickly, obviously the Timex glows a little bit brighter, it obviously has a little bit more surface area, but you can see that they are just about as legible as each other. The Moser is definitely no slouch, but again, it isn't the longest lasting lume. I think Moser definitely can improve on that a little bit, but I do still think they did a good job. It is cool to see those are just solid blocks of lume, and they're very, very legible. So pros and cons of the watch, and I think one of the biggest pros is definitely just the way it wears. It is a large watch, it's 42mm, but because it's so circular, because it has such thin lugs, it fits amazingly on wrist. Another big pro for this watch, and I guess just Moser in general, is it's very under the radar. It's much more of a like collector's cred type watch brand. It's not something that necessarily, I guess, flexes on other people, other than the fact that it does cost quite a bit of money. At the end of the day, it's just something a little bit off the beaten path, and they usually have an aesthetic that is not seen very often in the industry. Like this one in particular, there's not really that many high-end pilot-esque type watches. So to get this design and have it executed at this level is interesting. My last main pro is the fact that there is a genuine rarity factor to this watch and to this brand. There's only 50 of these exact watches made. It's probably never going to be made again. It's Moser's first Braun case. It's very weird in the sense that it uses a Cyrillic type print on the dial. So there's a lot of interesting, unique factors kind of playing in the favor of this watch as someone who maybe collects or is a collector of Moser or just a collector of oddities in the watch industry. And at the end of the day, those little unique random facts about this watch appeal to you, then this is definitely something you should look into. Moving on to cons, one of the cons I have with this watch is it is priced at $19,600 at retail. And I do feel like that's a little high. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't really say what's fair in terms of luxury because luxury is just luxury. Sometimes the prices don't quite make sense and they just are prices. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things where I believe they're more base model version of this type of watch with the blue Fume dials around $15,000 or so. I'll correct the price somewhere below. And their kind of dual time is around the same price as this watch. And that, I think, offers a little bit more uniqueness in terms of the movement and in terms of the functionality. So I don't think necessarily just the bronze case really in itself justifies the extra price point hike of this watch. I could be wrong. It can be very hard to finish or create the case for the watch in bronze. I don't know 100%, but I also just don't feel like this price is necessarily justified, especially when you look at the other things in Moser's catalog. Another con I have for this watch in particular, and I guess it's very particular to this model, is there are QC issues. For a watch that's nearly $20,000, it has a little bit more QC issues than I would have expected. It's not something that's major, it's not super glaring, but if you look a little bit closer, you do see it. Anyone with a decent loupe would be able to notice that there are imperfections on the hands of this watch. So I don't think that's something that should have passed the standard quality control, and I think that is a little unfortunate that it did. My last con for this watch is the fact that I don't feel like the movement feels particularly high quality in a way, or at least the winding itself comes across as almost overly tinny, overly screechy to me. With other watches that I've wound in the past from, like, let's say FP Journe or Longa, it has that kind of feeling where as you're turning the gears in the winding, it's just a much more reassuring click. It's a much more even sound to the movement. And with this watch, I just got an overly high-pitched screech from the movement, which I just wasn't expecting at all. Again, when you set the time, it feels fine. It feels very smooth, and I'm pretty sure it is a good movement. It keeps pretty accurate time. But it's just not a sound that I expected coming, especially at this price point. So final thoughts on this watch, and although the cons weren't a great section, I did actually like this watch a lot more than I thought I would. Online, it seemed very plain, very boring, and also too large. But when you have it in hand, in person, it makes sense. It fits with the design. It actually fits well for its size. It is proportional in itself. I think the dial, and I guess that's, again, what Moser's kind of most known for, stands out on this watch. It has a beautiful subtle sunburst to it. It pops pretty nicely, and it has a beautiful depth of color. So is this the most value for money watch you can buy at this price point? No, but that's also not necessarily what it's really about. Anyone who's probably considering a watch like this, or even a watch from Moser, probably has a bunch of watches already, honestly. And you've already experienced, let's say, Rolex, you've already experienced Grand Seiko, you've already gone through maybe some independent-ish type watches like Longa, even though they're a little bit more upscale independent. So it's one of those things where you just want to try something new and you're kind of used to a certain type of quality level. Maybe you like the look of the Zenith Type 20, but you don't like the fact that it's like 45 or 47 millimeters or whatever it is. This Moser is a watch executed in a very similar style to that Zenith, but I think to a higher standard. I mean, the movement looks better. The 3D numerals, I think, looks cool, gives it a lot of depth on the watch, and the Fume dial is awesome. So it gives a couple quality of life improvements that you would expect from a luxury product, but not necessarily $20,000 good. At the end of the day, if I had all the money in the world, I would absolutely have one of this watch, or probably any other watch from Moser's catalog. But again, I think you're buying a Moser just for more the niche factor, the cool factor of the brand. It is different. They are doing different designs and different aesthetics than most of the other people playing in that same price point. And it's also just cool to support a brand doing something different. And unfortunately, I don't have the wallet to support a brand in that way, but with the collectors that do, it's an interesting thing to do. You become a little bit of a family in a sense to the brand. I really like Moser as a brand. They do some really interesting things. Is this the most daring model that they make? Not at all. But I think you also need some of those more plain, kind of mass appealing watches to let people dip their toe in the water. and see if they like what the brand offers and what the brand kind of design language means. This is a pretty good watch. It's by no means a perfect watch, but if it appeals to you, go for it. I mean, maybe try to get them to throw in an extra buckle, since I think that should have been there in the first place, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of the video, and I'll see you in another one.